Okay, this is a good, all-around, easy to understand lesson on the Cold War. It's 9 minutes and 42 seconds, but has a lot of good stuff in it. Usually I don't like to post videos that long. I don't want to lose your attention span, but definitely a good video which covers pretty much everything that I'll cover individually a little bit. But go ahead and check this out, 9 minutes, 42 seconds.
The end of World War II saw two opposing superpowers emerging in the form of the United States of America and the Soviet Union. The United States was capitalist, a system where almost everything is privately owned and run for profit. The Soviet Union was communist, a system where everyone owns the means to create a common wealth, all based around a central ideology. After dealing with Nazi Germany, these two superpowers sought to spread their influence throughout the world, and thus the Cold War began. The Cold War wasn't a direct war, but a series of proxy wars and decades of intimidation, propaganda, and espionage. Germany was occupied after the war. The Soviets controlled the area around Berlin, but not all the city itself. There were already tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, as they felt threatened by each other and feared for a new war. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin didn't like the idea of West Germany regaining any former power, so in 1948 the Soviets blockaded the western sections of Berlin to force the other Allies to give them control of the whole city. It didn't work as the Western Allies airlifted supplies in. In 1949, NATO was formed to strengthen the Western Allies. Germany became divided into East and West, as was Berlin itself. Stalin wanted to be in control of the countries on Russia's borders to ensure security. Because of this, the Soviet Union claimed the states it had invaded during the war and established communist regimes within them. Stalin set up secret police within these regimes to crush opposition swiftly. Yugoslavia had been expelled by the Soviets in 1948 but remained its own communist state. Propaganda was spread by East and West to subvert their enemies. The world had been divided into East and West. United States President Harry Truman sought to contain the spread of communism by funding regimes under threat of a communist force. He also set up various bodies and organizations to effectively defend United States interests. A new communist power rose in the East in the form of the People's Republic of China in 1949. The old Republic of China retreated to Taiwan and remains there today. Korea had been divided in half after World War II, and both sides claimed to govern the whole country. To help further spread communism, China and the Soviet Union aided the northern government to invade into the south. Loads of United Nations countries came in to defend the South, with USA providing the vast majority of troops. The Korean War was fought to a stalemate. The armistice was only agreed after the death of Joseph Stalin. Korea remains divided in a state of ceasefire to this day. 1953 saw Nikita Khrushchev come to power in the Soviet Union. He openly criticized Stalin's rule and sought to move on to bigger and better things. In response to the creation of NATO, he created the Warsaw Pact, an alliance of the Eastern Bloc countries, in 1955. The United States and the Soviets spread their influence in the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, the Soviets backing groups trying to overthrow the old European colonial regimes. Some countries decided to stay out of the Cold War and not take sides at all. The Soviets quelled any rebellion in Eastern Europe with an iron fist. During the 1950s, the USA experienced a Red Scare where people lived in paranoia and suspicion of the spread of communist ideals into America. The McCarthy trials were like witch hunts to root out the communists in the United States. The end of World War II had seen the dawn of nuclear weapons. The USA began to build up an arsenal, and soon the Soviets developed their own nuclear weapons, and the two superpowers spent the 1950s testing them and displaying their might. Many people campaigned against the development of nuclear weapons, seeing the inherent danger. US President Dwight D. Eisenhower thought these weapons could be used to deter other acts of war. Ballistic missiles based on captured Nazi rocket technology were developed so they could launch their missiles from afar. This also led to the space race as the two nations frantically developed more and more technology. The Soviets launched the first satellite and the first man into space, while the United States won the race to the moon. Relations between the Soviet Union and China were worsening throughout the 1960s as they disagreed on how communism should be run. In 1961, the East German government persuaded the Soviet Union to build what would become the Berlin Wall around West Berlin to stop the young educated people from the East leaving to the more prosperous West. Communism had spread to Cuba in 1959. The United States attempted an invasion, training up Cuban exiles, but it failed. In 1962, the Soviets decided to place nuclear missiles in Cuba to pressure the United States into giving them West Berlin.
That was called the Bay of Pigs, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, this thing's going really fast.
From Cuba, the Soviets would have first strike capability on the US, countering the US Jupiter missiles placed in Italy and Turkey aimed at the Soviets. This situation led to a serious escalation, almost resulting in total nuclear war, but it was resolved as US President John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. The Cuban Missile Crisis led to a direct hotline being set up between the Kremlin and the Pentagon to at least improve communication between the two superpowers. Khrushchev was ousted 2 years later by his colleague Leonid Brezhnev. France withdrew from NATO, feeling that USA and UK wouldn't share the power. France wouldn't fully return until 2009. War had been raging in the old French colony of Vietnam since 1955, and even before that, between the communist-backed North and the mainly US-backed South. The US involvement grew and grew throughout the 1960s, but ultimately ended in defeat for the South and the US as the North captured Saigon in 1975. It was an embarrassment for the United States as the great superpower lost to such a poor nation. Other US and Soviet-backed conflicts raged throughout the world. Despite these proxy conflicts, the 1970s did see a thaw in the Cold War in a time known as détente, with improving relations between the East and West.
Détente was Nixon's policy towards communism.
The Union were finding that many of the economies within the Eastern Bloc countries weren't doing as well as the West, so the cooling intention was encouraged. US President Richard Nixon traveled to China and met Chairman Mao and improved their relationship, taking advantage of the split from the Soviets. Nixon also met up with Brezhnev, resulting in the SALT I agreements, which sought to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons being developed to create a more stable environment. They also agreed to not develop anti-ballistic missile defenses to maintain the threat of nuclear war as a deterrent. They increased trade with each other and brought about a period of peaceful coexistence. At the same time, Social Democrat Willy Brandt of West Berlin sought to ease relationships between East and West Germany, as well as Poland and the Soviet Union. The SALT II agreements were signed, but never ratified by the United States due to various Soviet...
SALT and SALT II stands for Strategic Arms Limitations Treaties
around the world, including the deployment of troops in Afghanistan to reinforce a newly established communist regime, which would begin a war that would rage throughout the 1980s.
That was the third proxy war of the Cold War when the Soviets invade Afghanistan.
Jimmy Carter and the United States boycott the 1980 Moscow Summer Olympics along with 64 other countries. US President Ronald Reagan and his strong ally British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher took a very strong stance against the Soviet Union, calling it an evil empire. To deal with Afghanistan, the CIA armed the Islamic Mujahideen to wage jihad on the atheist communist Soviets. Of course, part of this group went on to become Al-Qaeda. Yeah. The US and the Soviet Union spent tons on their military, building up huge arsenals, the Soviet Union having overtaken the US in the arms race. Reagan later claimed, "We don't mistrust each other because we're armed because we mistrust each other." Going against the SALT agreements, Reagan began developing anti-ballistic missile defenses as the Soviet arsenal continued to grow. All the while, Soviet leader Yuri Andropov feared of a US first strike attack. Later that year, a civilian Korean Airlines flight en route from Alaska to South Korea was shot down by the Soviet Union. After initially denying it, the Soviets claimed that it was on a spy mission. The US said otherwise. Times were tense. A few months later, NATO were having a military exercise named Able Archer, which simulated Western Europe going into DEFCON 1, ready for nuclear war. The Soviet Union had been so paranoid of an imminent attack, they believed this could be hiding the real thing and quickly readied their nuclear arsenal. The exercise thankfully ended peacefully, and the world once again escaped thermonuclear war. Phew. The Soviet Union and many other communist states boycotted the Los Angeles 1984 Olympics. This left room for many wins by Team USA, much to McDonald's dismay, as they had a promotion promising free food for any US medals. Good call, guys. Economic stagnation was becoming more apparent within the Soviet Union, which was not helped by the war dragging on in Afghanistan. The Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev brought in reforms to reorganize the Union and prevent corruption within the Communist Party. He also pulled the troops out of Afghanistan. Gorbachev and US President George Bush, not that one, signed the START I Arms Control Treaty in Moscow to actively decrease nuclear weapons. Due to Gorbachev's more relaxed policies, there was a rising demand for independence in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev refused to send Soviet forces to intervene, which led to a series of mostly peaceful revolutions. Anti-communist protests happened in China too, but ended in massacre. The Berlin Wall was broken in November 1989, and families were reunited after nearly 3 decades of isolation. On December 3, 1989, George Bush declared the Cold War over. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union itself was banned in the USSR, which led to the dissolution of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1991. This truly marked the end of the Cold War, and the world was left with one superpower, the United States of America. Some historians reckon that this brought an end to history, that the world had reached a height of civil society. The many regional wars and incidents in the wake of the fall of communism showed that this was, of course, not the case. Other historians reckoned that history couldn't properly progress without two conflicting ideals to move politics forward, that world politics would stagnate. Something certainly does smell fishy, all right. Thanks for watching, guys.
Anyway, so that was a war, it went through a lot of different things, but went with no detail. So that's just a basic overall video about the Cold War. Took 10 minutes, but now you have a better understanding of the Cold War.